Mary Queen of Scots is such a memorable name, don't you think? So memorable in fact that she has a nursery rhyme about her, to the tune of "Here we go round the mulberry bush," telling us how she got her head chopped off on a cold and frosty morning. Nursery rhymes are screwed up. Just take a look at Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Stuart and Elizabeth Tudor have shared a never-ending rivalry that has spanned throughout the centuries. I said never-ending rivalry that can never be ended. Doy! Public view has switched between the two queens, who had to establish their authority and sovereignty in a male-dominated world that believed women did not have the ability nor right to rule a kingdom on their own. Elizabeth succeeded where many others failed. Meanwhile, Mary lost everything: her throne, her country, her husbands, her son, and her head. Her life was a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare, although we would never see him write a play about her. I can't begin to describe how badly she messed up, but I'll give it a try. This is the calamitous life of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. I must state right away that Mary Queen of Scots and Mary I of England, aka Bloody Mary, are two different people. You yourself may not think you have to be told that, but some people do make that mistake. When I was in my last year of school, we were in a revision class for our A-level history, and I know you've heard this story before, you don't have to, but these people haven't. Come on, you. Yes, I was sitting in a revision class for my A-level history exam, like weeks before the exam took place, and as the teacher was going through our notes, one of them thought that Elizabeth had deposed her sister, imprisoned her, and then executed her. I kind of lost it. It's one thing to have that belief because you weren't studying the subject, but we've been studying this all year and we're literally like 2 weeks away from the final exam. God help them if they found out there were two Mary Tudors. Mary Stuart was born on 8th of December 1542 at Linlithgow Palace. Before she was born, the House of Stuart was originally spelt Stuart. It was one of the most ancient houses in Scotland before it ascended the throne in 1371, when Robert II, grandson of Robert the Bruce, the real Braveheart, became king when David II died without heir. King Robert's son was succeeded by Robert III, who ruled for 16 years. Following him, the throne of Scotland was occupied by 5 King Jameses. James is not a lucky name for kings. James I was assassinated in 1437 by his uncle Walter Stuart. His son, James II, died when he stood too close to a cannon.
The cannon exploded, my leg was shattered, I died of blood loss.
James III was imprisoned by his nobles, and later rebelled against by his own son, and killed at the Battle of Sochieburn. James IV, husband of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, attacked England while their king was in France, and was killed at the Battle of Flodden. James V was a year old when he became king. He lived in paranoia and ruthlessness and sired many illegitimate children. His 2 legitimate sons with Marie de Guise of France passed away as infants. He died on 14th of December 1542, following defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss. There was an ominous portent towards Mary's birth and the House of Stuart, that their line would begin and end, "We alas." It is true that the House of Stuart's hold on the throne of Scotland, and later Great Britain as a whole, would end with a female monarch, but it would not be Mary. Mary was born in the middle of Scotland's Reformation. The Protestant Earl of Arran, James Hamilton, won the regency over the Catholic Cardinal Beaton. He held the title until 1554, when he was overruled and replaced with Mary's mother, Marie de Guise. For anyone wondering, I'm not sure if this Hamilton is related to Alexander Hamilton. I didn't have time to study the entire Hamilton genealogy, okay? Meanwhile, down in England, Henry VIII must have been relieved that he didn't have to deal with another Scottish king who may one day raise an army against him or his descendants. He saw the infant queen as an opportunity to unite the two nations. He proposed Mary in marriage to his son, the future Edward VI. It was hoped that by doing so, it would end Scotland's long-held alliance with France, and England would not have to fight wars on 2 fronts. The Treaty of Greenwich was signed in 1543, when Mary was 6 months old. It did not last. James Hamilton converted to Catholicism and joined Cardinal Beaton in rejecting the treaty in December of that year. Mary, for her safety, was moved to Stirling Castle, where she was crowned on the 9th of September. England's retaliation to Scotland's defiance was called the Rough Wooing, an 8-year war on the English-Scottish border, attempting to secure Mary and marry her to Edward, even if that meant abducting the infant queen. Mary was moved frequently throughout this time. By 1547, the Scots looked as if they were going to lose the war. King Henry II of France, who had succeeded his father to the throne in March of that year, proposed a match for Mary with his 3-year-old son, Francois the Dauphin. The proposal was agreed to on 7th of July 1548. Mary left from Dumbarton on the west coast of Scotland on the 7th of August. She was accompanied by 2 of her half-brothers, along with 4 girls from the most noble families in Scotland, who would become her ladies-in-waiting. They would be known as the Four Marys, as they all shared the same name. There was Mary Beaton, Mary Livingston, Mary Fleming and Mary Seton. Fleming's mother Janet accompanied the girls as their governess. In France, Mary enjoyed a rich education. She learned to speak several languages, including Latin, Greek, Italian, Spanish and even Scots. She also became adept at needlework. A few examples of her work still exist today. She would be known throughout her life to express herself through her clothing. She also learned to play the lute and the virginals, which was expected of a highborn lady at the time. Mary became so accustomed to her French heritage and surroundings that she changed the spelling of her last name to Stuart. It remained thus even up until the days of Bonnie Prince Charlie. In Scotland, the rough wooing lasted 3 more years after Mary's departure. England conceded land that they had occupied during the conflict in the Treaty of Norham, which was ratified in 1551. This would be the last time the English and Scottish border was disputed before 1603. When Marie de Guise became regent of Scotland, she was able to maintain her authority over an increasingly Protestant population thanks to French troops. On the 24th of April 1558, aged 15, Mary married Dauphin Francois in Notre Dame Cathedral. As part of their marriage alliance, Scotland would be bequeathed to France if Mary were to die without heir, meaning Francois would be King of Scotland if he outlived her. The marriage between Mary and Francois is considered a happy one, even though it is likely that they never consummated their marriage. Francois was 2 years younger than Mary, was often ill, and had not developed properly puberty-wise. Regardless, Henri II reported that the 2 of them got along well from the first day they met. It was believed that there would be plenty of time for Mary and Francois to work things out and produce heirs for both Scotland and France. The rivalry between Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I began in November 1558, when the latter became queen. Due to her being seen as illegitimate, owing to the controversy of her parents' marriage, and the fact that she was only put on the throne because Henry VIII couldn't have another son, the French Catholics saw Mary as the true successor of the English throne. King Henry II voiced this publicly, and was likely planning to invade England to overthrow Elizabeth, and thereby rule England and Scotland through his son and daughter-in-law. Then came the joust. On 30th of June 1559, King Henry participated in a joust against Gabriel de Montgomery, where the latter's jousting lance impaled the king through the eye. He suffered in agony for 10 days before he died. Francois and Mary became king and queen in the middle of France's most uncertain points in history. For one thing, the crown was nearly bankrupt, thanks to the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. Mary appointed 2 of her uncles, the Duc de Guise and the Cardinal de Guise, as advisors. They were very unpopular, especially when faced with the Protestant Bourbons, who were next in line to the throne after the ruling House of Valois. Francois II's reign also saw the beginning of the French Wars of Religion. Protestantism was growing in France, and the Catholic nobility were determined to extinguish it. Any households that held a Protestant service would be burnt to the ground. Citizens were encouraged to rat out anyone suspected of being Protestant. These persecutions would continue up to and beyond the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. The English did not agree with Mary's claim to Elizabeth's throne. They blockaded and later sieged the Scottish port town of Leith. French troops had been based there, but struggled to hold off against the English as support was unable to reach them. This led to the Treaty of Edinburgh in July 1560, which saw the French troops withdrawn from Scotland, and Mary would stop displaying the English coat of arms alongside hers. Marie de Guise had died less than a month before the treaty was signed. The Scottish Parliament had made Protestantism the dominant religion. Mary and Francois refused to acknowledge the treaty and the religious reforms, but there was nothing that they could have done realistically. Francois II died on 5th of December 1560. His health took a turn for the worse in November. His cause of death is unknown, but it appears to have originated from an ear infection that turned into an abscess. Some suspected he was poisoned by Protestants. He would be succeeded by his 10-year-old brother, King Charles IX. The Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, assumed the regency over the Protestant Antoine de Bourbon, who was King Consort of Navarre. She did so by holding his brother Louis, Prince of Condé, hostage, and forced him to resign his claim to the crown. Condé was released soon after. Mary is reported as being inconsolable with grief in the wake of her husband's passing. She withdrew from the court for 40 days, as was expected. She remained in France for several months as she attempted to secure a second marriage where she could return to Scotland with a strong Catholic power behind her. One proposed match was to the Spanish Don Carlos, son of Philip II. It would have been an advantageous match, even though Carlos himself was feeble and underweight. This did not go forward thanks to Catherine de' Medici, who didn't want Mary to be in a position that would threaten the Valois, or her daughter Elizabeth, who was Queen of Spain. While she was still in mourning, Mary met her future second husband, Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, for the second time since her coronation as Queen of France. Eventually she left the French court for the last time in August 1561. She and the four Marys returned to Scotland, along with the rest of her household, including a contingent of musicians. Initially, she had hoped she might travel through England and meet Elizabeth, but this request was denied, so they had to suffice with sailing up the North Sea instead. She stood at the stern of her departing ship, watching as the country of her childhood slipped away from her forever. Farewell then, my dear France. I don't think I shall ever see you again. They arrived at the port of I should know this as a character in the show. They arrived at the port of Leith on the 19th of August 1561 after a misty voyage. It remained foggy as Mary touched down, which John Knox saw as an ill omen. He did that a lot. He didn't like Mary. She kept a brave face throughout the ordeal, and was received warmly by the town citizens. After a brief stay at the house of Andrew Lamb, she was escorted to Holyrood Palace with a contingent of Scottish nobles, including her half-brother James Stuart. On her first night in Holyrood, she was rudely awakened by a band of musicians who were playing very badly. She remained tactful and thanked them for their efforts. As a Catholic queen in a Protestant country, Mary was an outsider. It is likely that she did not have a Scottish accent like her countrymen either, and sounded French. Scots were viewed by the rest of Europe as primitive and uncouth. Nonetheless, Mary was determined to prove herself as a competent and cultured queen. She had a great love of music and would hire valets and other male servants who could sing or play instruments. David Rizzio was one such person. He was an Italian who came to Scotland in the service of the Count of Moretta. He became a musician for Mary not long after she returned from France, and became her secretary in 1564. Mary intended to demonstrate religious tolerance. She would acknowledge that Protestantism was the dominant religion in Scotland, but in return they would have to allow Catholics to say the Mass and receive the Eucharist. John Knox, remember him? He hated every last bit of this. He was basically the 16th century equivalent of one of those Bible Belt preachers who shout very loudly about how everyone whom he has a personal grudge against is going to hell, then proceeds to marry an underage girl. True story. The guy was in his 50s when he married the 17-year-old Margaret Stuart, who was the cousin of Mary, and he was very loudly criticised for this. Mary tried to appeal to John Knox, but he stubbornly condemned her behaviour at every chance he got, and loudly preached against her in public. Mary could only turn the other cheek and appear modest and patriotic to her people. She began to dress in Scottish styles, though stuck to wearing mourning until her second marriage. She and the other Marys had a habit of dressing up in male garb and walking through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise. Mary would often don male clothing throughout her years in Scotland, especially when it came to leading her armies into battle. Regardless of her plan for religious tolerance, Mary struggled to make the Catholics and Protestants reach an agreement. She did not win any favours from the Catholic faction when she executed the Earl of Huntly in 1562, because he rebelled when she gave the title of Earl of Moray to her brother. Mary mourned her first husband for a few years after returning to Scotland. Both she and Elizabeth would be nagged at by advisers on who and when they would marry and produce heirs. Elizabeth did not want to risk Mary marrying a foreign power and risk the security of England. She proposed her own favourite courtier, Robert Dudley, as a suitor. If she accepted, Elizabeth would recognise Mary as her heir. It doesn't seem as though any of the three of them took this matter seriously enough to follow it through. Mary decided to take a husband who was connected to the Scottish and English royal families, but not a foreign prince who would turn Scotland into a province. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, son of the Earl and Countess of Lennox, and descendant of Margaret Tudor, seemed like a perfect fit. He came to the Scottish court in 1565, encouraged to do so by Robert Dudley and William Cecil. Mary immediately took a liking to him and was knighted by her in May. They married in a Catholic service on the 29th of July 1565, though, as cousins, they did not receive the dispensation from the Vatican that was usually required in these situations. Whatever affection Mary had towards Darnley quickly vanished not long after they were married. He was a heavy drinker, and a violent one at that. He was instantly disliked at court, and felt emasculated by the lack of deference and authority granted to him as king consort. Mary did not grant Darnley the crown matrimonial, meaning if she died without issue, he would not become king in her place. Darnley became increasingly vindictive towards Mary. She became pregnant not long after they were married. In the meantime, the Earl of Moray had started a rebellion against his sister in protest of her marriage to Darnley. Moray struggled to garner support and fled to England. Mary took a more solid control over her Privy Council, appointing more Catholic lords and welcoming James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, back from exile in France. Darnley's behaviour worsened. In his anger, he suspected that Mary was having an affair with David Rizzio. He conspired with remaining Protestant lords who were loyal to Moray. They believed Rizzio was the true father of Mary's child. On 9th of March 1566, they burst into a dinner party that Mary was hosting to murder Rizzio. She refused to hand him over to them, and he allegedly hid behind her skirts. He was then dragged into her bedchamber, where he was stabbed 57 times, and his body was tossed down the main staircase. To this day in Holyrood Palace, there is a red stain on the floor where Rizzio was murdered, and a plaque to mark the spot. Darnley instantly regretted his actions and returned to Mary. The two of them fled Holyrood to Dunbar. Darnley was blamed by the Protestant conspirators for the murder. When they returned to Edinburgh, Moray was restored to the Privy Council. On the 19th of June, Mary gave birth to a son, James, at Edinburgh Castle. She named Charles IX of France and the Duke of Savoy as godfathers, and Elizabeth I as godmother. Darnley was absent from the christening. Mary tolerated Darnley for a handful of months before he met his sticky end. It was believed that she had begun an affair with Lord Bothwell. She suffered a brief serious illness but recovered before she met with some nobles in November 1566 to discuss how to get rid of Darnley. As a Catholic, she couldn't divorce him, and an annulment would make her son illegitimate. Darnley had withdrawn to Kirkhofield, one of his father's estates, as he had fallen ill, either from syphilis or smallpox. I'm more inclined to think it was the latter, as one could recover from smallpox. If it was syphilis, his enemies would have just let time take its toll. Mary regularly visited her husband for appearance's sake. On the 9th of February 1567, she left his side to attend a marriage feast. She and the court would have heard Kirkhofield explode. The house had been secretly laden with gunpowder with the intention of killing Darnley. He seems to have had some last-minute warning, however, as a chair was found hanging from his window and his body was discovered in the orchard, where he seemed to have been smothered or strangled to death. He is said to have begged for his life as his murderers closed in around him, saying, "Pity me, kinsman, for the sake of Jesus Christ, who pitied all the world." At the news of Darnley's murder, Elizabeth I was very concerned for her cousin, as she was the main suspect and had the most to gain from her husband's death. She wrote a letter on the 24th of February to voice her concern. "Madam, mine ears have been so astounded, my mind so disturbed, and so frightened to hear of the horrible and abominable murder of your late husband and my slaughtered cousin, that I have scarcely spirit to write, and however I would express my sympathy in your sorrow for his loss, so to tell you plainly, I cannot conceal that I grieve more for you than for him. "Oh, madam, I should ill fulfil the office of a faithful cousin or an affectionate friend if I did not urge you to preserve your honour. I cannot tell you what all the world is thinking. Men say that instead of seizing the murderers, you are looking through your fingers while they escape, that you will not seek revenge on those who have done you so much pleasure, as though the deed would never have taken place, had not the doers of it been assured of impunity. For myself, I beg you to believe that I would not harbour such a thought." And it was true. Mary did not immediately call for Darnley's murderers to be arrested. Regardless of her guilt in the act, this was the beginning of the end for her reign. Bothwell received most of the blame for Darnley's murder, and he is regularly portrayed as the killer in most media. 3 months later, Mary went to visit her infant son at Stirling, which would be the last time she'd ever see him. Bothwell had decided to marry Mary himself. On her way back to Edinburgh, he took her prisoner. She was briefly held at Dunbar Castle before he returned her to Edinburgh, and they were married in a Protestant service. Bothwell had divorced his wife just 12 days previously. The fallout from this match was enough to turn practically all of Scotland against them. What little support Bothwell and Mary managed to gather quickly dwindled. On 15th of June at Carberry Hill, Bothwell was allowed to flee while Mary was taken prisoner. As she returned to Edinburgh, onlookers denounced her as an adulteress and a murderer. Afterwards she was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle between Perth and Edinburgh. It was considered the perfect prison for her, as it was on an island in the middle of a massive lake. In late July she miscarried twins and was forced to abdicate the throne. Her son would become King James VI, with Moray as the regent, and her son would be raised in the Protestant faith. Bothwell fled Scotland in the hope of raising another army. He was quickly arrested off the coast of Norway before being taken to Denmark, where he was arrested in Dragslum Castle. He remained there until his death in April 1578. He was chained to a pillar for so long there were grooves in the floor where he once stood. Mary was kept at Lochleven Castle before she managed to escape on the 2nd of May 1568. She raised an army of 6,000 men, but lost the Battle of Langside 9 days later. She crossed the Solway Firth by fishing boat on the 16th of May, taking refuge at Workington Hall in Cumbria. 2 days later, Queen Elizabeth's local officials took her to Cumbria Castle, while Elizabeth tried to decide what to do with her. Mary had hoped Elizabeth would help her reclaim her crown, one queen to another, but Elizabeth wasn't about to fix Mary's blunders. She did not want to help her cousin, nor did she want her to leave England to rally an army. English Catholics who had been oppressed by English law and saw Mary as their true queen would be incentivised to make her a figurehead. As an anointed sovereign, Elizabeth didn't want to outright kill Mary either. Elizabeth ultimately decided to keep Mary under guard in various locations in the English Midlands, under the watchful eye of George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, and his wife Elizabeth Hardwicke, better known as Bess of Hardwicke. These locations had to be far from London, far from Scotland, and far from the coast. Of the 4 Marys that had been with their queen throughout their lives, only Mary Seton remained. Beaton, Fleming and Livingston had been married while they were in Scotland, and were unable to help or follow their mistress into exile. Seton, on the other hand, had refused to marry, and she had taken a vow of celibacy. Seton remained by Mary's side for the majority of her 19-year imprisonment. She continued her role as Mary's hairdresser. Although Mary's household was reduced over the years, Seton remained until 1585, where she retired to a French convent, headed by Mary's aunt Renée de Guise. She remained there until her death in 1615, where she had spoken French so much she had forgotten all English or Scots. As long as Mary was alive in England, she was a threat. No one knew this more than Elizabeth and her spymaster, Francis Walsingham. Walsingham himself had prevented many assassination attempts against his queen, including the Ridolfi Plot and the Throckmorton Plot. The conspirators were caught and publicly hanged, drawn and quartered. This form of execution had become far more commonplace in Elizabeth's reign. Even high-born traitors were being subjected to it. Many Catholic rebels faced martyrdom at this method of death.
As a Christian, I can think of nothing more glorious than to be tortured and killed by other Christians over minor details in the church service.
Nobles also died trying to free Mary, including the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. Walsingham was unable to fully prove that Mary had endorsed these plots. and this is where his spy network was at its most cunning. Another plot was underway, led by a Jesuit priest named John Ballard and an English gentleman named Anthony Babington. While Mary was held at Chartley Castle in Staffordshire, Walsingham tasked one of his spies, Gilbert Gifford, to infiltrate Babington's circle. The plotters were intent on gaining support from Spain, who would invade England and back Mary's rise to power. The struggle was trying to communicate with Mary, as she had no way of communicating with the outside world. Gifford acted as a courier, meaning every letter sent between Babington and Mary would be read by Walsingham. The letters were written in code, which were concealed in hollowed-out corks for beer barrels that were delivered to Chartley. Even coded, Walsingham found out what they said. Mary's letters reflected how bitter and resentful she had become under her imprisonment, and supported the plotters' designs on assassinating Elizabeth. Walsingham trapped the plotters further by adding to one of Mary's letters to name those that were involved. The final letter from Mary said, "Let the great plot commence." The plot was foiled before it could be started. The conspirators, including Babington and Ballard, were arrested and given the traitor's death at Tyburn. Mary was riding out on the 11th of August 1586 when she was arrested. She was kept at Tixall Hall before being moved to the ominous Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. Francis Walsingham, George Talbot and William Cecil sat in on her trial. Mary denied all charges against her. "Look to your consciences and remember that the theatre of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England." She claimed she was not an English subject and therefore could not be tried for treason under English law, and as they were not her equals, they could not condemn an anointed queen. But when did being Scottish ever prevent the English from executing someone?
King Ed hanged me then a lovely touch. Pulled my guts out. Guess he didn't like me much.
Mary was found guilty and sentenced to death, but Elizabeth hesitated for months to sign her death warrant. To execute a monarch, even one that had abdicated their throne and was imprisoned in another kingdom, would set a deadly precedent. She was also worried about how the Catholics of Europe would react, not to mention King James, who was 19 at the time. Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant on the 1st of February 1587 and gave it to William Davison. Davison immediately took it to the Privy Council, who decided to take matters into their own hands before Elizabeth could change her mind. The night before Mary's execution, she set her affairs in order by writing her will and writing letters to King Charles IX of France. Oh no, he was dead by then. And sending a final letter to King Henri III of France. Charles IX had died in 1574. King Henri and Catherine de' Medici had written to Elizabeth in order to plead clemency for her. Nonetheless, on 8th of February 1587, Mary left her rooms at Fotheringay Castle and was escorted to the Great Hall where a scaffold was erected. She wore a black dress which concealed a bright red petticoat underneath, the colour of a Catholic martyr. She said to the executioner, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Having dressed down to said petticoat, she knelt before the block before she was blindfolded, and laid down her neck, and said in Latin, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner really bungled the job. The first strike hit her in the back of the head. The second did not behead her completely. I know this is distressing, but I gotta tell the people. In order to completely sever her head, the executioner sawed through the rest of her neck gristle with the axe. If this was not shocking enough, when the executioner went to pick up her head, he realised he was holding on to a wig. Mary's head fell to the floor, where it was reported her eyes and lips kept moving for 15 minutes. Her pet terrier, which had been hiding under her skirts, emerged and mourned for its owner, dying not long after. Elizabeth denied all wrongdoing in Mary's death, claiming that the warrant had been dispatched without her approval. Davison was imprisoned. Oh, Alan! My fault for offering him a paper bag. Davison was imprisoned in the Tower of London, but released not long afterwards. The predicted outcry at Mary's death was justified. In France there was a violent uproar, which was only pacified when King Henri ordered the court to dress in mourning for their former queen consort, and a funeral mass was held for her on the 13th of March. Is that a delivery? Oh, sorry, package delivery. I thought it was the Rain box set. It's not the Rain box set. Like, that would be really fitting. Though Mary and Catherine de' Medici were not the best of friends, she was still shocked that a monarch would murder one of her own. The Catholic plots in England didn't stop. Elizabeth became so paranoid about being assassinated that she forbade male courtiers from wearing cloaks indoors, which might hide their swords, and she started walking around with a sword of her own. Philip II of Spain used Mary's death as a rallying cry to invade England with his infamous Spanish Armada. The attempted invasion the following year failed spectacularly and is often regarded as one of Elizabeth's greatest triumphs. Following her execution, Mary's remains were embalmed but remained unburied for 4 months. Eventually she was interred at Peterborough Cathedral, although she had requested to be buried in France. She remained thus for the rest of Elizabeth's reign. In 1603, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, uniting the two realms into Great Britain. 9 years into his reign, he had his mother exhumed and reburied in Westminster Abbey, not far from Elizabeth's final resting place. The Tudors had proved to the world at large that anyone could be put to death by rule of law, even an anointed sovereign. Not only that, but Mary Stuart herself had shown those in power could overrule their monarch and criticise their conduct. 55 years after Mary's execution, the English Civil War began. Said war would see Parliament rise in arms against King Charles I, grandson to Mary, Queen of Scots. By the end of the war, Charles would be found guilty of treason and publicly executed in London in 1649. Though there was an attempt to rule without a monarchy, they were restored not long after, but the power the king or queen would have over their people would never be the same again. Mary, Queen of Scots is one of Britain's great catalysts. The English Civil War would not have ended the way it did had Mary never been executed. History remembers her as a romantically tragic character, but a strong-willed and brave woman nevertheless. As someone who grew up in Britain, I have seen her pop up in our culture many a time. She has such a poetic name that it's kind of hard to ignore her. Pretty much every children's history book, except Horrible Histories, were very vague about what happened to her. I remember reading this children's strip of summarising Mary's life, and rather than go into detail about why she was executed, it just said Elizabeth got so sick of Mary she decided to chop her head off. I am really interested to talk about how Mary failed so miserably while Elizabeth succeeded as queen. I'm not picking a side in their rivalry, I'm just enjoying the view. Were these two always meant to be rivals, or could they have been allies in another life? I guess we'll find out. The next video about Mary, Queen of Scots will touch on the lost media surrounding her. There are a lot of operas written about her or that include her, and not all of them I can find. Much like with the Lady Jane Grey operas, although I do hope Mary's operas are not as cursed as Jane's operas. But after that video we'll move on to rankings and the Reign seasons 3 and 4 review, whichever one comes first, and then we'll have the video essay. So yeah. So this look is going to change. This is currently just one of the looks I'm making, because having Mary and the 4 Marys makes me want to create. Okay. The rankings is going to be an exceptionally long list. Even when you take out all the lost media, you're looking at 15 different Marys. I'm going to enjoy this. Okay, you know what sucks? I just took the whole hair down and did a speech and thanked my patrons and all that stuff, and I realised the camera wasn't recording. That's just so mean. Well, I'm not putting it back up again because I took my earrings out as well. Ugh. And my earlobe's bleeding. Anyway, that was the history of Mary, Queen of Scots, and I'm really grateful for you watching it. But anyway, if you like this video and you can't wait for the next Mary, Queen of Scots video, or the next Richard III video, or the next Titanic video, make sure that you like, you subscribe, share this around, leave comments. It really does help bring support to this channel, and I'd be very grateful for you to do so. And I'm also very grateful to my patrons whose names you see on the screen right now. There are benefits to joining, such as getting your name in the credits, and also getting early access to scripts and videos, depending on which tier you choose. There's also a Discord that's open to all tiers of patronage. I'm going to do one I haven't done for a while, get my giant fan out because I just really can't stand this heat. And of course I have my King and Queen patrons. They're the highest tier of patronage. Their names are Alison Cuff, Annalise Barnett, Jilmai Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. Thank you guys so much, and I can't wait to bring you more videos. And yes, more Titanic videos are coming, one of which is a sequel to my 50 Famous Faces of Titanic video. If I can get that up by Christmas, I'd be very satisfied. I'm working on the script right now. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe. See you later.